welcome to the Libertarian Counterpoint, where we like to bring issues from a libertarian perspective to you. And again, this week, our host, James Just, is off at the State Fair representing the Libertarian Party. So if you happen to be there, show him some love and drop by the Libertarian booth. So I'm filling in, and my name is Jason McPhee, and I do the show Knuckleheads of Liberty, which can also be found on Mondays on this channel at 5:30 p.m. So you can check that out. And we also have a guest, and this is actually part 2 of a show that we did last week. And this is going to be where we're talking to W. Bruce Lee from the Phoenix Correspondents Commission about issues of tax and debt that are plaguing our nation. And so, Bruce, we left off where we had described what the problem was and some of the historical issues of how we got to the, in fact, if you haven't checked out that show yet, $34 trillion in debt. Quick recap, I guess, of the problem. We're spending more on interest than we are on our military, it sounds like.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, and it's growing. And we're currently at 121% debt to GDP ratio. And that is geared to go to over 150, upwards to 200% within just 30 or more years. So it's unsustainable. We were talking about that. And where we left off, we were talking about the fact credit ratings of the U.S. Treasury is being brought down and down and down, which makes our interest expenses go up and up and up. That our Social Security Trust Fund will be depleted within the next 9 years. I mean, there are a lot of significant issues that we have to face as a nation.
Right, so the last show was all bad news, so I think you're going to give us maybe some light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully?
Well, there's some light, and the solutions are simple. So it's not like it's, brain surgery or this type of thing. So that's good news in that regard. But I did mention about other countries backing away from the U.S. dollar and using the ruble, using the Chinese yuan as alternate currencies, which is not good for us in general. But what I'll say is this: history shows that people go broke slowly and then all of a sudden. And so you push that curve, you push that curve, you push that curve, and then all of a sudden you don't know when you're that close to the edge, and oops, son of a gun, and off the cliff you go. And
I think that the very first signs of that is when you start seeing prices change rather rapidly, I guess. That would be a pretty good sign that things are going out of control?
Well, inflation is a related factor, but then it's really and that's not a good thing. Mm-hmm. But the fundamental flaw is that our Congress has been highly dysfunctional with the inability to control itself. And that is the fundamental issue. They have the power of the purse, not the president. I mean, he has to sign the bills and this type of thing, but Congress has the power of the purse. And we've seen in the past 40 years under Democratic and Republican dominance, this tendency to spend money and spend money and spend money. And these are indeed structural issues. These are not partisan issues. These are things that affect all of us, regardless of background, stripe, gender, etc. I had the privilege a month or two ago speaking with Congressman Chris Stewart of Utah. And he just retired after 12 years. And we were basically trying to pull the curtain back on Congress and say, okay, well, what's the inner workings like? And here are some of his comments to me. He says, this is the most dangerous time in our nation's history since the 1850s. And that's when he went into the Civil War. He said, most members of Congress do not fully appreciate the responsibility they have. Some do, but others are more interested in getting reelected and things like that. Good news, he pointed out, we can fix every one of the problems we have. Again, it's not brain science, but most of Congress thinks Americans are cowards. The American people are not cowards, according to Congressman Stewart, but Congress thinks they are. And so I say, hey, you got to bite the bullet, you got to do this, you got to do that, and they're going to go, oh, But I find Americans are resilient. They're tough. We've had to be, and we need to be that way again. We can't, you got to have some hardness to ourselves, pick ourselves up by our own bootstrap. We've become thinking that if I have a problem, someone else is going to solve my problem for me. And that's a very unfortunate mentality that we're actually breeding in our society. Government's responsibility, not me, you know, and I call, you know, the bullshit flag, you know, and say that's not true. It is our responsibility, not the government's. And ultimately, it's going to come back to haunt us.
And do you think that the reason people have been conditioned to think this way is maybe a combination of our politicians telling us that it's not a problem, maybe a combination of public schools telling us to have, I guess, you know, government-run schools telling us that government is the solution to so many of our problems?
Well, we do look to government in a lot of ways as solutions, and government, there's a place for government, but my own personal experience over many decades is government really doesn't solve problems. In my own personal experience, government may put a Band-Aid on the cut, but it rarely doesn't solve the problem. And we could have a whole show and just talking about that.
I almost think maybe the government's putting leeches on the...
Maybe putting leeches rather than using Band-Aids, perhaps so. The Congress, the last thing that Congressman Stewart pointed to me is that Congress does not do a good job in engaging on substantial intergenerational problems. They're very short-term, well, I got to do this, and I got to do that, and I got to be reelected. And as some folks have mentioned, Congress is not incentivized to think long-term. It's like, oh, I got to get this next election in 2 years, or that type of thing. And D.C. simply has become a favor factory. So, hey, if you'll maybe come here and, yeah, I can get you a little tax cut here, or I'll do this. It's, you know, the favor, but hey, and thanks for your contributions, and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's all a little bass-ackward. And even, frankly, and sometime we can talk about this, why do people run for public office? In my personal experience, and I've been in public office myself, I think most of those that run for public office do it for all the wrong reasons. And frankly, I told this to a reporter one time, my own personal opinion, just because you're elected does not inherently mean that you're really smart. And
that's been demonstrated in spades.
That's true. The other thing I'll mention about Congress is this. Legislative bodies, either the state legislature, Congress, etc., are typically very poor at setting priorities. I was talking to the Speaker of the House in California here a couple of years ago. We were down in San Diego, and there was a small group, 15 or 20 of us, and the question came up, says, you know, Madam Speaker, what are the big priorities for next year? And he came and said, well, we got to do this, and we got to do that, and well, you got to do education, and got to do this, and they paused and says, well, we just have to do everything. Now, I didn't want to say anything at that moment. I did not want to make any embarrassment. But about 20 minutes later, when we were all breaking up, I went over and spoke to the Speaker, and I said, hey, Madam Speaker, doing everything is the definition of having no priorities. So we can't be the wish list for the world. Save the whale, save the turkey, save the this, you know, whatever is a great thing. I spoke to one college student one time who told me her epitome of concern, her biggest priority in life was to have chicken welfare, you know, here in California. Treat chickens right. And I'm pro-chicken. But I had to say, you know, I know there's 100,000 people that just got killed over here, and I knew this over here, and so I'm pro-chicken, but I'm not sure that it's the biggest priority and how I would prioritize it myself.
And you know, that lack of being able to prioritize, I think, comes down to that problem of imagining government as a solution to all your problems, because once you do that, then you don't really have to have priorities. You just think government's going to do it all.
Yeah, there's truth to that. Probably the fundamental flaw in Congress is their commitment to any debt stability by one Congress is not binding on the next Congress. So back in the 1990s, Congress, in fact, did balance the budget and as a share of gross domestic product. And this was called the Great Moderation. And they established fiscal rules. But ever since, for the past decades, they would routinely circumvent, suspend the rules, et cetera, and we're in the place where we are today. Congress eventually needs probably an external enforcer upon itself. And the other thing that Congress does have a tendency to believe a little bit, not all Congress members, but some are deluded by the pie and sky theory of modern monetary theory, which says, hey,
You mean magic monetary theory or modern?
Well, they call it modern monetary theory, but it's like, hey, don't worry about the national debt. Even if though here just a month or so ago on 60 Minutes, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell said national debt is both worrisome and urgent. The modern monetary theory is that sovereign debt is not a concern because as the economy grows, economic growth will grow as well and subsume that debt. Well, there's some truth to that, but it's based upon three legs of the stool. One, the economy will continue to grow. Two, interest rates will remain low. And three, there's always someone available, some sucker says, yeah, I'll lend you some money, you know. And we've seen that's not true today. And as Powell pointed out, the debt is continuing to grow faster than our economy. It's unsustainable. Quote, I don't think that's controversial at all, unquote.
You know, there's one other thing I've heard that often said by people like Krugman and others, but they say it's not a problem because we owe it to ourselves. But that seems like a very collectivist way of imagining things. It's certainly
but it's not actually owing to ourselves. Now, the first individuals we went to say we need some money were people who would take bonds or nice little old ladies who had money in their shoebox, etc. And so we borrowed that out. We tapped that market a long time ago. And then we began to go to borrowing from our own trust funds, you know, Social Security, et cetera. And then that became like tapped out. And then some time ago, we began to say, okay, let's go to China, let's go to here. And if you remember on the last show, I spoke about the trillions of dollars that we owe to non-U.S. citizens. And China was like 1.5 trillion owned by Chinese nationals themselves. But there's also a fundamental thing that happens. When you get into this situation, federal administrative programs become less responsive and less accountable to the constituents. The federal government tends to have more and more waste and fraud and abuse. And then you find yourself that I will go to the state and say, hey, state, I was just talking to Governor Mike Huckabee the other day, and I said, hey, state, here's some money. You know, and the state said, oh, good, we want some money, you know, so we'll take that. But then that money dries up, and then the state's left with that responsibility. So the states need to begin to say, hey, this is my constitutional responsibility, I'll take care of this. That's your constitutional responsibility, you take care of that. And that's where we begin to move into solutions.
Well, you know, just when they get that money, too, doesn't that wind up creating a lot of problems going forward because they wind up starting programs that then never want to end, so therefore you wind up having to search for more money yet from the public to keep funding these things?
Well, indeed. And you find states like Tennessee that are actively looking at getting rid of federal funds. Mm-hmm. Now, I come from a background in the California's governor's finance. And one thing I can tell you for a fact, when it came to the general fund, man, you watched that like a hawk. When it came to special funds, mental health, well, okay, you watched that a little bit, right? This was a mentality. Came to federal funds, who cares? It's federal money. And that drive me nuts because, hey, that is taxpayer money. It's not federal money. That money came from the states, went to the feds. They're giving it back to us. You know, we need to scrutinize that as much as anything else.
Well, and a great example of that, quite frankly, was the recent COVID funds that were just shoveled out to all the states, and it's sort of like, what happened to it? I think there's a lot of places that don't even know it might have gone to prisoners or other things in places.
And you look at homelessness and here in, say, California, and, you know, the billions that were spent, but there is no significant improvement. I mean, accountability is really important in anything that we do. Mike Braun is a U.S. Senator from Indiana, and he shared this with me a few months ago. He says, Congress isn't just balanced by the Supreme Court and the President, but also by the states. And Article 5 of the Constitution gives the states the power to pick up the slack when Congress fails to act. And that's exactly where we are today. And the solutions of bringing our debt into balance do not have to be harsh. I was speaking to the Speaker of the Nevada House, who is highly concerned about education. I said, hey, we got this fiscal issue going on here, blah, blah, blah. And I remember she said, but, you know, we got to protect education. I said, well, yeah, I'm not saying, you know, I'm not anti-education. We don't have to cut education. You might want to cut something over here or here, but you don't have to be draconian. Simply making a 1% change here and then doing it again. And that builds confidence in that we're getting our house into order, etc.
But you know, it is funny because you talk about making maybe a 1% cut. It seems a very modest way to approach the problem, and yet a lot of times, you know, they don't even want to see a cut in growth to the programs, let alone, in fact, they'll even literally call, you know, just decreases in growth of a program a cut instead of actually cutting the program by 1%.
And as our economy does grow, that does sort of balance out the pain in the cuts in that regard. Now the Swiss have offered a wonderful illustration, and it's called the Swiss debt break. And it was not overly draconian. It was approved in 2001 by 85% of the Swiss voters. And its debt at that time was about 65% debt to GDP ratio. And they implemented it in 2003, and by the end of 2023, their debt ratio is now 17.8%. But it simply said, hey, you need to balance things out, but think multi-year. And if you're a little bit high this year, you use some of the reserves that we need, and then stuff it away. And so it was a very reasonable approach. So these are fairly simple solutions. And Germany has a debt break rule that limits its government structural budget, and they're doing better. And recently, Utah and Arizona have issued statewide mandates or open letters to all the states. And here you have in Utah saying, our country faces a deficit crisis that is inconceivable but entirely predictable. In the other states, we need to collaborate, and Congress has not been responding, and we go into some other details here. Now, how are we doing on time?
I think we have about 10 minutes left.
Okay, great. So Utah was saying, hey, other 49 states, we got to buck up, and we need to collaborate. And that was a good thing. And Arizona, in February this year, responded saying, yes, indeed, we join with Utah and their legislature that we have to collaborate and work together on this national debt issue. And so that's very, very encouraging. And, you know, again, as I point out, this is not a conservative or a liberal issue. Professor Lawrence Lessig, a professor of law of Harvard Law School, not known to be the most conservative institution in the world. But he says, I'm in this fight for a constitutional convention for not for academic reasons, but I'm in it because I believe this decision to push for a convention is essential to solving critical problems our democracy faces, issues agreed to by parties of both left and right. So, the solution, if Congress will not rein in itself, and it needs some type of external enforcement, the proposal would be for a constitutional amendment, simply saying, hey, something like the Swiss debt break or something reasonable has to be implemented.
Something with some actual teeth that they can't just give themselves an escape hatch from every time that the budget comes up, I guess.
Something with some actual teeth. Now, Article 5, now we're getting into some of the details here, and we've sort of gone from a progression of what's the problem, possible solutions, causing, this type of thing. Article 5 of the Constitution, there are two ways to amend the U.S. Constitution. One, Congress can make an amendment and propose it to the states, and if 75% of the states ratify, boom, it's part of the Constitution. Congress probably is not going to propose its own amendment. Unlikely. Maybe, who knows. Or if you have 2/3 of the states, or 34 states, saying, hey, Congress, we need to call for an amending convention to come and discuss these issues. One of the things that the Phoenix Correspondents does is that we actually monitor all what I call state movements, and where do we fall, being close or far away from these goals of calling for a convention. And there are three primary movements in the area of balanced budget. One is an organization called COS, or Convention of States, and it proposes three things. It says we need a fiscal responsibility, we need term limits on Congress, and we need to limit the scope and size of the federal government. Now, one of the challenges they are facing is this. They're proposing three things at one convention, and there are many people in the community who are concerned that if you have an amending convention, maybe it'll run away and start doing lots of other stuff, save the whales, or whatever it might be. Now, there really are safeguards against that, but because they're proposing three things, that puts them at a bit of a disadvantage. Another major movement, frankly, is called the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force, which is how I was originally introduced to this whole process. And they achieved 31 applications from states in 2017, and then there were some rescissions, and there are around 28 states now since 2021.
And out of the with 28, how many do they need to? Is it 2/3?
You need 2/3. You need 34.
Okay.
2/3 is actually 33.33, but you need 34.
Okay.
And then there's one other effort called the Federal Fiscal Sustainability Foundation, which, upon doing research, and we're auditing that research ourselves as part of the PCC, asserts that indeed there were 39 active applications for a convention, 5 more than the 34, as early as 1979. He was submitted to Congress, and Congress just didn't do anything. They put it in a drawer, they didn't count them up, whatever it might be. And there's active movement now to say, hey, Congress, we have to hold you accountable for not, the bell was rung. We reached 34, you didn't ring the bell, and now that's your bad. And maybe they didn't have the incentive to do it, maybe they weren't organized, but there are attorney generals now actively working on saying, hey, we got to resolve this issue.
Well, Bruce, and we have about 4 or 5 minutes to try and resolve this issue for our listeners. So I was wondering, is that, I guess, what is it that, where are you guys at the Phoenix Correspondents Mission on this?
Well, let me segues perfectly, and 2 or 3 minutes I think is more than enough time. I mentioned the former comptroller, David Walker, fine fellow. He made this comment. He says, the PCC is very important and very timely. Washington is out of touch. It's totally out of control. It's lost control of our nation's finances, and the status quo is unacceptable. The PCC was created in 2017. The Arizona legislature, through its foresight, called for the first national convening of all states since 1861. That was a phenomenal achievement of itself. To say, hey, how are we going to balance state and federal authority? How are we going to address federal fiscal reform? And as part of that, the last thing they did was create the Phoenix Correspondents Commission, which is a 50-state government body, highly unique, to be a forum of communication among the 50 states on these important issues, to speak to Congress with a singular voice, to educate the American citizenry, and to empower state legislators in the power they have. Chief Justice Roberts made this quote some time ago: "The states are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they got to act like it." You know? And so it's time to step up to the game. So we monitor all Article 5 activity. We educate state leaders, we're a repository of information. And when it comes to holding an amending convention, our responsibility would be to administer it. And in that regard, we're the anti-runaway solution. And there are many reasons a convention would not run away, and there's a bogus, an unnecessary concern out there in the general public by that. 19 states right now already have faithful delegate acts saying, you're here to go vote on the A, B, and C. If someone comes up and say, hey, let's talk about Q, E, and F, you're immediately revoked. And if you violate this, you know, you have a criminal offense. So if you have a few more states added to that, which is not difficult to do, you could not have a runaway convention, because if you got off on topics Q, E, and Y, the quorum would leave. So there are many guidelines there. And even if they came up with the silly amendment, save the whales, would 3/4 of the states actually ratify that? Highly unlikely.
Well, Bruce, if somebody was really interested, I mean, everybody should be interested in this issue, but if somebody was watching and they say, how can I help? How can I get involved? Is there something they can do through your commission, or is there some way they can get active and talk to their congresspeople?
Sure, absolutely. We do have the website, www.phoenix-correspondents-commission.gov. It's a long name, you know, and that's my same email, which is bruce.lee@phoenix-correspondents-commission.gov. And being a government agency gives us a lot of credibility. And so we're not just a bunch of guys down at the local bar talking about this or that. We're not some partisan organization.
Like your average libertarian club, where it's a bunch of people grousing.
You know, we're looking. We take these responsibilities very seriously. And so simply come to the website. I think there's an information link. You could, send me an email or that type of thing. We'd be glad to be involved. And our responsibility is to work and educate citizens as well as legislators.
Okay. Well, this has been a fantastic discussion, and it's great to hear that there's some hope out there and that somebody is working on this problem. So I'm so glad you could join us today, Bruce. And like I said, check out our first show too, so you can see what the scope of the problem of this is. Thanks so much again for joining us, Bruce.
Thank you so much for the hospitality.
Well, thank you, and thanks for joining us out there. And until next time, stay tuned and stay free.